Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's review, we are doing one of my absolute favorites. They just keep putting out new ones, so I'm going to keep doing them. We've got an Imperial Stout review from Hubbard's Cave. So if you've seen a lot of our Imperial Stout reviews, you'll know that I have done many a Hubbard's Cave, and it seems like every one I grab is just absolutely top tier. And they keep coming out with new and interesting flavors. So long as they keep doing that, I'm going to keep snatching them up because I absolutely love what they're doing in terms of Imperial Stouts. So first we're going to be starting with Coffee and Cakes. This is an Imperial Stout, 12% ABV, and it's brewed with abacus coffee and maple syrup. So you got your coffee. The syrup is like the syrup you pour in your pancakes, obviously. So Coffee and Cakes. There we go. Beer number 2 is Coco Van. This one is also 12% ABV, and this one's brewed with toasted coconut and vanilla bean. So we've got two completely different flavor directions, both Imperial Stouts by Hubbard's Cave, and they're both clocking in at the exact same ABV. Hubbard's Cave is based out of Niles, Illinois, and we're going to jump right in getting started with the Coffee and Cakes, the abacus coffee and maple syrup, 12% ABV. Okay, so jumping right in with our first beer. This is Coffee and Cakes, 12% ABV Imperial Stout, brewed with abacus coffee and maple syrup. Can art, theirs tend to be pretty plain, but on here they've got what looks like a pen drawing of a stack of pancakes with some butter melting down the sides, probably been soaked in some syrup dripping down the sides, and a nice steamy mug of coffee. And indeed, that is a wonderful breakfast combination there, or dinner or lunch for that matter, but I imagine it's going to translate well into an Imperial Stout, which we're about to find out. So we got it cracked. Let's get it poured right in the glass. As expected, this is as dark and thick as ever with Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stouts. Very, very dark, very, very thick. I won't quite get that whole can in here, but that's okay. Don't want that dripping down the side. Okay. Visually, this is indistinguishable from any other Imperial Stouts. It is absolutely pitch black and thick as could be. You cannot even see a hint of light through anywhere on this glass. It is pitch black. For the head, I tried to get a little more aggressive than I usually do because theirs are so thick. Sometimes they don't form the best head. This one formed okay. It's got a little head on there, kind of a light brown color. And I can tell you, aroma-wise, I can already smell it from here. A lot of their beers, indeed I'd say most that I've tried, have been very aromatic, very pungent in sense of aroma. And you can smell it from quite a ways away. I can definitely smell the maple syrup, but I'm going to get a little closer and see what I see. Oh, gosh. Oh, that smells so good. It's ridiculous. You can smell 100% the coffee and the maple syrup, and it smells like it's in equal balance. It's 50-50 on the aroma. God, that smells so good. Oh, man. Oh, Lord, I can't even wait to jump in, so I'm not going to wait any longer. Let's see what this tastes like. Oh, God. Every time Hubbard's Cave, every time. God have mercy, that is so good. Oh, it's transcendent. I'm having to search for my words. Oh, have mercy. That is delicious beer. Okay, snap out of it. We've got to talk about this. All right. So, the pungency that you get in the aroma absolutely translates into the flavor of this beer. It is big and bold and in your face, just as you would expect from a Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stout. Their Imperial Stout game is just stupid strong. It's just stupid strong. As with all the others I've tried up to this point, it does taste a little sweet. Some are a little sweeter than others. This one's not overtly sweet. I think it's toned down. So yeah, I mean, they don't say it's a milk stout. They call it an imperial stout, but there's no question that they brewed with some lactose to sweeten it up a little bit, which really helps blend and take some of the edge out of it because it's so big and heavy. But with the flavors that they put in there, a little sweetness really kind of makes it into this even more rich and dense dessert-like state without the ridiculous volume of the heavy malts kind of killing out the additive ingredients they put in there. So even though it's got deep, rich roasted malts, you can taste that coffee independently of the malt bill. And because it's slightly sweet, that maple really comes out in the beer. And it's true in both in terms of the aroma and also in the flavor. I'm going to jump in for body, mouthfeel, finish and see where and how this flavor develops. The body is medium heavy. It's not as heavy as I anticipated, especially having had prior. This one feels more medium heavy. It's got good presence, but it's a little lighter than you expect at 12% ABV. The body is viscous. There's definitely a thickness to it. Rolling around the mouth, it's very smooth. I wouldn't say it's creamy or silky, but it's smooth. It feels a bit too viscous for it to cream up rolling around the palate, but it does feel nice rolling around the palate. I'm going to have to jump back in to see where this flavor develops and finishes out, but I'm going to finish topping this off, this last bit out of the can, not wasting any bit of this black gold. Yes, that's the good stuff right there, folks. That's the good stuff. I'm not wasting a drop if I can help it. Okay, one more dive. Let's explore this flavor. You first get it in your mouth, you get that sweetness. It's not overt, but it's sweet enough that you know this is a big, rich dessert beer. And that immediately opens into that very deep, rich, heavy malt backbone and the abacus coffee. And they start marrying together. And out of that rises up, coming out of the arm of the sweetness, the maple. And it intensifies and it mixes with the coffee and the malt. So it's almost in equal parts, coffee, roasted malt, and maple syrup that comes through in the flavor of the beer. There is just the slightest hint of a boozy edge to it. It's not enough that it would be off-putting to people that don't like that. I personally, I'm a fan in a big ABV beer. I like a little bit of a booze edge to it is not a bad thing. It lets you know you're drinking a higher ABV beer. I don't want it to overpower the other flavor and aroma elements of the beer, certainly, but everything in balance has its place. This is subtle. It's there, but it's subtle. The sweetness and the natural intensity of the maple and the coffee and the malts really don't let it come to the forefront, but it's very, very nice. One more sip here. Sweetness, slight booze, coffee, malt. Maple comes out of the side, straight out of that sweetness. They all marry, intensify. And at its apex, I think the coffee is probably slightly more intense than the other flavors that come through in this. And it kind of holds there in peaks. And there's malt just sticking, you know, with it on one side, and the maple sticking with it on another side. Just that lingering slight sweetness. Even though it's slightly sweet, and it's a big ABV, big-bodied, viscous mouthfeel beer, this one actually doesn't feel heavy. Some of their others feel heavy. This one doesn't feel as heavy as others. And the finish is pretty even. Once it hits that apex, it lasts quite a long time. It kind of slowly starts dropping down the bell curve. And this one is a bit more of a traditional kind of curved shape where it kind of troughs out and then slowly dissipates out at the end. It's not a nosedive down. At the very, very end of the finish, what you're left with is coffee, a little underlying smokiness of malt, and just a whisper of that maple on the back. and that's how it finishes it out. The coffee's on top, the malt's just behind it, and just a whisper of maple. It's got a very long finish. It's an absolutely delicious beer. I'm going to take my time, finish sipping on this, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we're going to jump into number 2, Coco Van, the toasted coconut and vanilla bean Imperial Stout. Again, 12% ABV. Okay, moving on to our second beer of today's Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stout review. We are moving on to Coco Van. This 12%, just as they both are, and this one is brewed with toasted coconut and vanilla bean. So already, both of these just really good ingredient selections that I imagine are just going to pair exceptionally well. Now, there is some label art on this one as well. It looks like a skull atop some coconuts, atop a nest made of a pile of vanilla bean. I'm going to try to get it closer in the camera view, but keep it from glaring. Looks pretty neat. Again, it's kind of like a pen on paper drawing. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and get this one cracked. All right. And yet again, as expected, this is as dark and thick as the prior. This is the prototypical Hubbard's Cave appearance. Very dark, very thick. Trying to agitate this as best as I can to give it a chance to form a head. Their beers are so thick that they often have trouble, even though they have a good bit of effervescence. And it's very fine in this one. I know it'll be impossible to see in the camera, but there is a lot of activity. Super fine. I mean tiny, tiny, tiny carbonation bubbles coming up from the sides of the glass. They're all really, really small. I mean, among the smallest I've seen in a while. Almost like the fineness of the carbonation you see when you have a Guinness poured off a nitro tap and it's rushing up, forming that head. It's akin to that. Super, super fine. Visually, I mean, as expected, it's pitch black. There's not a hint of light getting through this beer. The head formed as best as it could. Again, just a small little head. It's a very thick beer. It does have a hard time with the heads in my experience. Give it a sniff. Yeah, this is another one, actually, I could smell from over here. Their beers have very pronounced aromas in general. This one smells interesting. I'll say it doesn't have the most pronounced coconut and vanilla aroma to it. It reminds me a lot more of deep roasted coffee than it does of toasted coconut and vanilla. It's in there. And it mixes kind of with a slight sweetness, but it's not as pronounced as, say, the malt backbone. There's not coffee in this one. It's just going to be the rich roasted malt that's bringing through that character. So this head's almost completely tanked anyway. I'm just going to finish topping this off. It'll all fit. All right, and then we're going to dive in. Let's do it. Okay. Ooh. Immediately, this beer has a boozy edge to it that the coffee and cakes did not. This has a more pronounced booziness. It's not overbearing. It actually pairs well and helps cut through some of the natural sweetness that's in their beers, because again, this is a slightly sweetened and it's a dessert style Imperial Stout. I'm sure that they add lactose and give it a little sweeter edge. The toasted coconut is subtle. Coconut's a challenging ingredient to get in beer, in my opinion. I've had many, many, many different beers that have coconut, and one of two things happens. Either one, it's completely overbearing and it kind of kills everything else in the beer, or two, it doesn't really come through as I presume that the brewer anticipates. This is in there, but it's subtle. It's subtle in the back, and it's kind of marrying with the roasted malt character. The vanilla is kind of pairing with that boozy edge, and then they're all kind of just rolling around together in the middle. And kind of mix matching in and out of one another. So I'm getting roasted malt mixing with coconut, and I'm getting booze mixing with vanilla, and I'm kind of getting them just kind of smashing in together and going all in and out and mixing and popping in and out in the forefront of the flavor profile. It's actually a very interesting way that the flavors develop, and it's hard to pinpoint down. I'm going to jump in for body and mouthfeel and start to get a sense of where these flavors develop, then I'll walk you through the finish. The body on this one is medium heavy to heavy, as you might expect from 12%. It's very, very close to the coffee and cakes, really no discernible difference. Mouthfeel on this one is about the same as well, only this does feel a bit creamier. If you really roll it around the palate, it starts to cream up a bit more than it does on its own. It's got a lot of viscosity, so it naturally feels quite a bit thick in the mouth, and in tandem with the heavy body that it presents, it's got real substance rolling around the palate, but it does start to cream up as you roll it a bit more aggressively. Flavor developing. I'm going to have to jump back in. There's just too much to process. Initial sip, you get sweetness, slight booziness, and vanilla. That's the first thing that you get. And the booziness kind of intensifies, and that sweetness and the vanilla, they're still kind of there. As that starts to slowly dissipate, the malt backbone comes through, and it tastes very roasty, and it tastes very coffee-like, and then you can start to taste the coconut as it pairs with the malt bill. Those stay kind of intact together, and then that kind of boozy edge and that sweetness and that vanilla come back into the picture, and they just start mixing all together. It's really hard to say where the flavor ride takes you, other than really where it starts, where the individual flavors come in and how they combine, and then they kind of intensify and peak. Then they just kind of butt heads for a while, just coming in and out of one another, and then it slowly starts its very long, kind of even finish out to the end. And it's a long finish. It's got a lot of viscosity. It's got a lot of staying power. And at the end of the finish, the dominant flavor that I'm getting is, pleasantly enough, coconut and vanilla. And there's still just that hint of a boozy back and that hint of a slight nod to a coffee flavor from the roasted malt. And the sweetness really gets out of the way, except for kind of on the edge where the vanilla and the coconut marry at the very end. So it's a very interesting flavor ride. Isn't what I anticipated up front, but on each sip, if you write it out, if obviously 12% dessert Imperial Stout, this is not a beer that's meant to be chugged or slammed. It's meant to be sipped and enjoyed and savored over an extended period of time, much like one would do a finger or two of really good scotch. I'm an Isla man myself. But nonetheless, this one is really a beer story that's all about reward on each sip and taking the time to explore it and really think about it. It's really interesting how it develops its flavor and kind of throws your palate for a loop. But as you let each sip go through the full ride of the start, the peak of the intensity, and really think on it as it goes out to the very, very long finish, you are absolutely rewarded with a very, very fun ride. And I really appreciate where it ends with its namesake, Coco Van. It ends with toasted coconut and vanilla. And it's just beautiful how they pair together after mismatching in all of these various and sundry fashions as it's building and peaking and troughing and hitting its apex and going down the ride to finish off that clean with a beautiful toasted coconut and vanilla. It's fantastic. I love this beer. I'm a big fan of all Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stouts that I've tried this far. I've got quite a few more coming to me in the few weeks coming up here. I'm hoping to get my hands on a few more, but I think I got 2 or 3 more, all of which I've never tried. So this is a really great beer. I thoroughly enjoy it. It's very well balanced, very well done indeed. I'm going to take my time sipping on this, count my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to thoroughly enjoy, and I mean it every time when we're doing Hubbard's Cave, absolutely thoroughly enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them ranked. Starting off with the coffee and cakes, Again, both beers, Imperial Stouts, 12% ABV on both. And Hubbard's Cave is based out of Niles, Illinois. That's a burb just outside of Chicago. The coffee and cakes was brewed with abacus coffee and maple syrup. So that was kind of the shtick, coffee and cakes, named aptly so. Starting with the aroma. As is quite common with Hubbard's Cave, they're beers you can smell from a significant distance away. They're very pungent with their aroma. This was no exception. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Taste on this one. I absolutely love this beer, and admittedly, I am not the biggest fan of maple syrup at all. When I'm eating pancakes, I actually use fruit-based syrups. I like strawberry or blueberry, strawberry in particular, but maple's a very pungent flavor for me, and it's easy to overpower in beer. I've had plenty of beers with maple, and a lot of them will pair, say, with pecan or maybe hazelnuts or walnuts or something like that in the base. You get them a fair bit with nut brown ales and some darker ales. Maple can be very overpowering, but it wasn't. This was exceptionally well balanced in all terms of flavor. They both came out big and bold, but you could get them both in equal parts as well as the malt backbone. Perfect 10 out of 10 for me for the flavor. I absolutely loved it. Body on this one. The body's certainly above average, but for a Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stout and 12%, whether or not it's Hubbard's Cave or not, this body actually didn't feel quite as substantial as some of the prior that I've reviewed, and I've done quite a few now. This one was above average, but it only gets a 7. Mouthfeel on this one. Mouthfeel was nice on this beer. It was certainly well above average, but Hubbard's Cave and some other big ABV Imperials can often have a problem where they're so viscous that the carbonation that comes through doesn't let the mouthfeel cream up. This tried, but it was so thick it had a hard time. It was still above average. It was nice, but not top tier. It gets an 8 out of 10. Finish on this, ridiculously long. I mean, ridiculously long. This is one of the hallmarks of Hubbard Cave's, really all their beers that I've tried. IPAs and Imperial Stouts. Those are the two classes of beer I've tried that they've done. All of them ridiculously long finishes that just keep going and going and going and sticking with you. This was no exception. Perfect 10 out of 10. Head and retention. Again, talking HC beers, they're very thick. They're very heavy. They're very dense. And doesn't seem, no matter how aggressive I pour, they have a very hard time forming a head because they are so thick. The carbonation has so much viscosity and thickness to make it through to form the head to even begin with, let alone retention. It's a tall order. It did okay. It did average on this one. It gets a 5. Appearance-wise, classic textbook, black as night, can't see light through it at all. That's a textbook Imperial, gets a 10. Balance on this. I was ridiculously pleased and thoroughly blown away. I mean, I shouldn't keep getting surprised by their Imperial Stouts, but I do every time because they're all different. And every time I just find, my God, I mean, it takes you to beer nirvana. If you're a fan of stouts or Imperial Stouts and you've never had one by Hubbard's Cave, I implore you, do whatever you've got to do to get your hands on these. If none of the stores near you sell them, no bottle shop, no Total Wine, no local distributor, get on Tavour. Tavour.com. There's an app on the iPhone. I'm sure there's one for Android. Just download the app. Check it out. I still haven't done it yet, but I can post my personal code for Tavour. That'll get you $10 off your first order if you're new to it. I'm going to post it on my website, www.thecraftbeercorner.com. And make sure, and I'll post it on my Facebook group as well, the Craft Beer Corner. So anybody that's not gotten into Tavour yet, that's looking to get their hands on all these insanely delicious beers I get all the time and review all the time, you're going to be able to get in on the loop and you will understand immediately exactly why I've been going on about them for months now. Unbelievable. Nonetheless, unbelievable balance, perfect 10 out of 10. I mean, everything in this was in equal parts. The maple did not overshadow the coffee, nor did the coffee overshadow the maple, nor did either of those overshadow the malt bill. This was a master class in how to balance an Imperial Stout. Perfect 10 out of 10. Filling in the intangible, you guessed correctly. No hiding it here. I'm not subtle. I loved it. Absolutely loved it. 10 out of 10. finally, as an example of the style, while there were a couple categories that I didn't give top marks, really, when we're talking about the whole package here, you know, you could fence line it, but the average comes out to, overall, this beer is a top tier beer. It just is. They do some of the best Imperial Stouts currently of any brewer that I could name, and they are consistent, absolutely consistent, delicious, and they're all different. They may seem the same, they may have similar ABVs, they may even use the same base malt bill, but the adjuncts and ingredients they're adding in to make the specific flavors completely change the beers, and they are just top tier. They are world class for my money. Gets a perfect 10 out of 10. That brings the total score on coffee and cakes to a 90 out of 100. So another ridiculously high score for a Hubbard's Cave Imperial Stout. I do believe that they are brewing some of the best Imperial Stouts in the world right now. And certainly if you haven't had any, you owe it to yourself to get your hands on some. Moving on to number 2, Coco Van, 12% again. This one was the toasted coconut and vanilla bean Imperial Stout. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this one, again, was quite pungent. You could smell it from quite a far away, but it actually wasn't as robust and pungent as the prior and some of their others. Even though I could smell a good bit away, I couldn't really pick out what it was I was smelling. Then when I actually got near the glass, I had a hard time picking out the coconut and the vanilla. I could smell different elements, but you know, pungency alone is part of it, but being able to pick out what it is I'm smelling is another part. I could get hints, but it wasn't full on in your face. But nonetheless, it only loses a point. It gets a 9 out of 10. Taste, just as with the prior, they absolutely nailed it. And this was a category I actually teeter-tottered on, but I think if you're drinking this beer as an Imperial Stout should be drunk. That is to say, not quickly, not slammed. It's a beer that's enjoyed over quite a long period of time. On average, I take about 2.5 hours to fully enjoy one of their beers. You sip on it much like you would do with scotch or, you know, whatever your poison is when we're talking hooch. But if you take each sip into consideration from start to finish and let it take you on the amazing ride that it does and thoroughly think about what it is that you're experiencing on each sip all the way to the end before you have another, you are absolutely rewarded for your patience and your efforts and your actual thinking about what it is you're experiencing. Beer is meant to be experienced. It's not about slamming. It's not about getting buzzed at all. I mean, to each his own. If that's your bag, I'm not judging. But I enjoy beer because of what it is, the whole experience. And to have a beer this complex that lasts that long and you finally get the aha moment at the end of the finish, that's just a special, special beer for my money, and I absolutely loved it. It does get a perfect 10 out of 10 for the taste. Body-wise on this one, same as the other. It was certainly above average, but it was actually a little less heavy than I expected for a Hubbard's Cave Imperial at 12%. I give it a 7. Mouthfeel on this one. Mouthfeel on this one actually was a little bit better than on the first. In fact, it was very, very close to having a perfect mouthfeel for me. I really had to roll it around across my palate quite vigorously to get it to cream up, but it was a lot less resistant than the prior, even though it was viscous. It seemed to have a bit more carbonation, active carbonation, and when I started rolling it, it really started to creaming, all those fine bubbles just mixing in the viscosity of the beer itself and the thickness, and it really creamed up. It gets a 9 out of 10. Finish on this one, equally as long and complex as the prior beer, and for the same reasons, you really were rewarded by really thinking on and experiencing each sip from start of flavor to end until it was no more on your palate. I mean, that's just a masterclass in an Imperial Stout. It's well worth the wait. If it takes a minute, 2 minutes per sip, it's worth it. Just enjoy the beer for what it is. Gets a 10 out of 10. Head and retention. This one actually did quite a bit better than the prior. It formed a little bit quicker, it formed a little bit thicker, and it stuck around quite a bit longer. Still, again, it's so thick, it's hard to get in a top tier echelon with their beers, but it did well. It did above average. It gets a 7. Appearance-wise, same as the prior, textbook, black as night, 10 out of 10. Balance on this one. I went back and forth on this, and while I stand by my comments about the taste and the finish, the balance on this I had to dock a point, and the reason is, even though I finally got both the elements of the beer at the end of the finish, and that was my reward, and they came through equally, the coconut was still quite subdued through the majority of the flavor profile, and indeed even in the aroma. I would have liked a little more. Even though coconut's one of those ingredients that can very quickly overpower whatever else you're doing in your beer, in this instance, I would have liked just a little bit more. So I did dock 1 point. I gave it a 9. Feeling in the intangible, I loved it, as I seem to love all of their Imperial Stouts. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Just as with the prior, I nitpicked a few categories and it did lose a few points, but overall, across all the categories, objectively and subjectively, this is a world-class, top-tier Imperial Stout. And for me, it's well-deserving of the perfect 10 out of 10 it gets, which brings the total score on the Coco van to a 91 out of 100. So we're only looking at a 1 point difference, a 90 and a 91. And honestly, you know, as it goes with beers, I'm not going to tell you which one I like more. It could be the higher score. It could be the lower score. It's up to everybody. A few points here, a few points there. Doesn't really matter. At Days End, we're ranking objectively other than one subjective, because my own personal feelings are important. And as a beer enthusiast and a beer experiencer, your personal opinion of a beer, even though it may be fantastic and top tier in all these categories, it may not be a beer for you. It could just be how they pull it off. It could be the style, but it's not for me to judge. It's not for me to decide. That's why, even though I'm completely objective, I did make one category for my subjective thoughts and feelings. And I think it's important when rating beer that subjectivity does actually enter the equation. Be objective where it counts, but have like a part where you say, did I actually enjoy that? What did I think of that beer? Because at Days End, if you're not enjoying the beer, what's the point? Doesn't matter what the brewers say. It doesn't matter what the critics say. It matters what you think. Doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. It's all about you and your experience. So nonetheless, that's 2 more slam dunk, absolutely fantastic Imperial Stouts by Hubbard's Cave. I absolutely love this brewer. I have been loving everything that I've tried. I've probably had about 8 or 9 of their beers now. Imperial Stouts, IPAs, the lot. And they have all been absolutely fantastic. I've loved every minute of it. So that's today's review. Folks, as always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in. Please don't forget, I know I say it at the end, but that's the mantra. Like, comment, subscribe. Likes help the channel, helps others find us in the feed. Subscribe will keep our videos in your feed, and if you ever lose it, you can just go to your subscriptions and catch up on any content you missed. Comments are really big. I want to know what your thoughts are, what your opinions are, feelings, questions, any suggestions. Let me know in the comments. Stuff you hate, things with which you disagree. I just want to engage with you, and let's talk about craft beer. That's what the comments are for. Lastly, if you want to keep in the loop and know exactly when our videos go live to YouTube, just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Till next time, folks, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.